Fallout Equestria the Chrysalis, Chapter 26, One Way Out.
I'm not gonna hurt anyone. I just want to go my way in peace. I am not your enemy.
I opened my eyes, looking down at the unconscious changeling laid out on the bed before me, then scanning slowly around. The wall of green contacts remained steady, save for the cluster of red Ocelli had warned me of. The weight of the pitbuck felt unusually heavy. I had no idea how they decide who is or isn't hostile, or whether my own mental declaration of intent could possibly influence it. One fact did give a measure of encouragement. Despite having rendered one of their members unconscious, none of the other changelings were showing as hostile. This suggested that there needed to be some sort of active intent involved. So long as my intentions were not to cause harm, it was possible I would not show up as an enemy. Or maybe they showed up as non-hostile because they didn't know what I had done and therefore had no reason to consider me as an enemy. I could be marked with a red pip to every changeling in the hive, and I had no way of knowing it. If so, then hopefully my mark would be lost in the sea of other contacts. Considering that it would be a lone red mark in an otherwise solid wall of green, that seemed unlikely. Still, there were no guards coming in and no alarms sounding. I was in a precarious position, but I had not yet fallen. Now, it was time to act. I swapped my restricted pitbuck for Ocelli's, a task made simple with the latches they had been retrofitted with. If anyone did a tag search, they'd see me here in this room, even if Ocelli was elsewhere. Next, I restrained Ocelli. This involved copious amounts of wax, or changeling goo, as many ponies call it. Her legs and wings were bound, her muzzle bound shut with just enough of a gap to breathe, and her horn covered. I laid it on thick enough that I felt thoroughly drained by the end of it. With that more immediate necessity out of the way, I turned to her pitbuck and the information it contained. It was a matter of moments to get information on Ocelli herself. She had recorded her title as Infiltration Operations Intelligence. Kind of a big deal. Good news. I now had top-level security clearance and a high-ranking disguise. Bad news, she was important enough to be both well-known and for her absence to be swiftly noticed. Her pitbuck also had a detailed map of the entire stable, and I studied it intently. Tracing back our routes, I found the Equipment Depot number 1, where I had been given a pitbuck, and where Ocelli had mentioned our confiscated equipment. Tracing further back, I found Simulation Chamber number 1, which from the layout looked to hold around 50 pods. 3 simulation chambers of similar size filled out the rest of that entire level of the stable. The level above that appeared almost entirely military, with barracks and armories. Above that was the entrance. I quickly traced out an intended route, a plan formulating in my mind. Soon, there was only one final thing to do before leaving. Looking down at Ocelli again, I hesitated. I felt so conflicted about what I had to do, but it needed doing. There was no way I was going to do what I needed on the tiny amount of love I had. I pressed a button on the pitbuck now clasped to Ocelli's leg.
I'm sorry.
Another press ended the brief recording, and I followed on the unpleasantness ahead. I leaned in close and pulled. Ocelli twitched, then jerked, moaning out as she instinctively tried to cling on to the love I tore from her. But her unconscious mind was unable to resist effectively. Soon, her moans turned frantic and fearful before devolving into weak and pitiful whimpers. When I was done, I carefully tucked her into the bed, as if trying to make up for the nightmares I had inflicted upon her. I doubt it did much good. The first step in escaping Serenity was simply escaping this one room. There had been a guard outside the room, which made walking out troublesome. I couldn't leave as myself, and if I left as Ocelli, it might lead to a conversation where I had to act out a personality I had virtually no experience with. There were too many pitfalls there. I also couldn't leave as some other changeling without raising even more questions. The only other way in or out of the room was the ventilation, which was far too small for a changeling to fit through. In our natural form, that is. There was a good reason I had needed Ocelli's love. I gave a quick search around the room, and thankfully found exactly what I needed. A picture. There were a small collection of framed pictures, about a dozen in total, but there was one in particular that fit my needs. It showed Ocelli and a few other changelings, including a couple of soldiers, posing atop the half-constructed office building I had seen above. Each of them was grinning, or waving at the camera. Ocelli's smile looked particularly smug and prim. The ventilation grate was easy to pry open. With that done, I focused on pulling up my magic, digging deep into my reserves. Green flames blotted out of the world for a moment, and when it returned, everything looked huge. The world had grown to gigantic proportions. Even the bound changeling beside me on the bed was a giant, her head larger than me in my entirety. I had disguised as a raccoon, easily small enough to fit into the vents, and with dexterous little paws. The addition of a changeling horn sprouting from the raccoon's head certainly resulted in an unusual look, but I was hoping this form wouldn't be seen at all. Between my grasping paws and diminutive magic, I was able to hollow Sally's pip-buck and the borrowed picture up atop the dresser and into the vent, pulling the grate shut behind myself. I scurried down the tiny passage, passing more grates along the way. Most of these opened into other quarters, and I saw that Ocelli's was unusual in belonging to a single changeling. The first room had 6 changelings, though only 3 beds if one counted the worn couch. The next held only 4, 3 of which were sleeping in a pair of beds, while the 4th was typing on a terminal. The third held 7 changelings, 4 of whom were sharing drinks and conversation, while the other 3 were being quite intimate and passionate in the bed nearby. Every room had multiple beds and a good number of changelings, mostly sleeping. Assuming these rooms were even remotely representative of the hive as a whole, it seemed likely that the hive was hot bunking. There might even be more changelings there than I had initially estimated. After passing several more rooms in a crowded hallway, I found myself looking into a small cleaning closet. It was perfect. I pried open the grate and climbed out, dropping to the floor. A quick tug of my magic unraveled my disguise, and I clamped the pip-buck to my leg once more. Then I brought out the picture, studying it. Specifically, I studied one of the soldiers and their armor. It wasn't entirely unlike mine, but there were a few details I would need to address if I wanted to pass without notice. Guards had enough authority to get away with more than an average changeling would, and from what I had seen, were still common enough to be somewhat anonymous. With at least 1,000 changelings living here, I hopefully wouldn't need to imitate any specific changeling. I just needed to avoid standing out. I revealed what parts of my armor fit with this hive's armor, which, to my relief, was all but the hoof boots and helm. With those in place, I focused, taking my time with a particularly difficult change. Assuming new forms is easy, adding artificial accessories like a hat or dress was more complex. Adding detailed, intricate, and relatively bulky accessories such as several pieces of armor was particularly complex and difficult. And just to add insult to it all, it would be almost worthless as armor, though I had at least had good cause to expect that detail to not matter. A minute later, I had perfected the change. My armor looked spot on for that of the soldiers in the picture. My appearance had been minutely altered to the point where I no longer looked like myself, without specifically imitating any particular individual. Nodding in satisfaction, I tucked the picture behind one of the racks of cleaning supplies, turned to the door, and stepped out. I kept my mannerisms completely casual as I stepped out into the busy hallway. There was no hesitation or looking around. I simply stepped out, shut the door behind me, and walked down the hallway as if there was nothing unusual about it. I understand the psychology behind it, but it's always amusing to me how readily people will accept something as being completely normal if you simply act as if it's normal. I walked steadily through the crowd, my eyes watching my way through the hall without ever engaging with any ling. No ling paid any attention to me as I walked along. I was just one more anonymous face in the crowd. Adrenaline continued to tug at my nerves as I followed the route I had memorized. I had spent years as an infiltrator, passing myself off as a pony. I had been ready to undertake great personal risk in the service of my hive. I had even daydreamed of infiltrating one of the ministry hubs, or even Canterlot Castle. But in all that time, I had never imagined I would be infiltrating a changeling hive. Even the most experienced and capable infiltrators might hesitate at such a task, full of danger and difficulty. The successful infiltration of a changeling hive was like a ghost story. Some fanciful tale of suspense told to eager-faced young infiltrators. Actually doing so was the stuff of legends. While such things would obviously be cloaked in secrecy, I knew of only 3 times a hive attempted to infiltrate another, and none of them ended well. Yet there I was, right in the middle of some other hive. If you ever played some of the Fallout DLC, holy shit, the ones where they take off all your gear and you're left with shit? Oh man, it's such a bitch, but it's fun though. Anywho, let's get on to our fun donators. Top donators: Jessie Smith, Star630, BadassWaffle, Only One Thing, and Ceru Orion. Magic, JockeTF, Darkside, Rayden, Narwhals, Blackmoonheart, Pastel, Sky, Rolan, Swordbrother, Mordred, Omicron, Lyrae, Runescythe, Will, Chris, Twinkie, Rise, Soul Shadow Moon, Luigi, Chancer Crust, Big Smoke, Bobcat, Murder Princess, Jet, Calidus, Little Mighty, and many more amazing people. Thank you all so much for watching this video and live life to the fullest.